The briefing ended with a hiss as the shuttle's doors opened to a wall of wet heat, and she stepped down into the breath of a world that smelled like old leaves, mineral rot, and thunder. The instructors called the place Delta 4, but the cadets whispered the local nickname with tight smiles, the Drencher. Clouds stacked in charcoal layers from horizon to horizon, pulsing with blue veins of distant lightning. A wind moved over the swamp as if the planet itself exhaled, bending the fern palms and ruffling the skin of the black water. She squinted into the glare and lifted her pack, more a pouch than a bag, while the others unlatched alloy trunks that unfolded into tidy stacks of hex panels and shimmering membranes. The assignment had seemed simple on the surface: construct a functioning shelter before nightfall and demonstrate the basics of fire, potable water, and thermal stability. The hidden part, the part the Academy never wrote into the score sheet, lived in the air itself. It waited in the sky and in the greasy mud that sucked at boots, in the vine nets that could yank a careless person to the ground, in the sudden absolute shifts between silence and storm. The Drencher loved to turn confidence into a puddle. She walked away from the gravel landing patch without ceremony, avoiding the bright clusters where alien cadets compared kit lists and angled for the flattest ground. She cut toward the darker edge of the tree line and paused on a hummock that rose just high enough to escape the lazy tides of the swamp. The hummock held 3 gum trees with flaking bark and an understory of wide, ribbed leaves that cupped puddles like green bowls. She planted her feet and let sound settle. Insect static in the reeds, frog laughter somewhere to the left, the distant flap of something heavy lifting from a branch. She inhaled, tasting tannin and iron. If the sky wanted to drown her, she would need elevation, drainage, and a roof that could shrug off a river. Behind her, a crystalline cadet named Syrinx called something cheerful about sharing a joint frame, and a reptilian classmate named Vrel clicked open a tripod of carbon struts as proud as a parade officer. Syrinx always spoke with the certainty of well-tested schematics. He had memorized material tolerances for 6 kinds of alloys and treated rain as a load to be factored, not a personality to be respected. She liked Syrinx well enough. He had the neatness of a locksmith and the optimism of a student who had never been cold and wet long enough to hate a planet. She lifted a hand in acknowledgement but kept moving. If she accepted a place inside another person's solution, she would learn nothing from the Drencher besides how it sounded when it ripped expensive fabric. She tested the ground with her boot. The hummock held, the soil squished but did not swallow. She circled the 3 trees, watching for the subtle slope that would direct runoff away from a sleeping place. The west side dipped toward a reed-choked channel that gleamed like a knife. Good. Water would leave in a hurry. The east side rose just enough to make a floor. She knelt and pressed her palm to the dirt. It oozed between her fingers, cool and slick. She imagined a mat of woven vines under a bed of fern fronds, then imagined the mat floating when the first hour of rain turned the hummock into an island. She would need anchoring stakes and a roof steep enough that water would not linger long enough to find a seam. Resin would seal the weave. If the resin failed, she would be sleeping in a bog. She flexed the knife from her belt, a short blade with a stubborn edge and a handle that had learned her hand. The instructors had allowed 1 tool. She had chosen the one that did not break when dropped. The other cadets began to sing their work into existence. Syrinx's alloy sections clicked into place with the smug rhythm of precision. Vrel's membrane unfurled like a soap bubble and drifted onto its frame with a chime, turning iridescent as it read the humidity and promised to repel it. A pair of insectoid twins drove anchor pegs with synchronized taps, their antennae tasting the air. The Academy loved devices that looked like answers. She let the spectacle pass behind her eyes without slowing her hands. She cut vines from a sapling that wore them like jewelry, snipping near the base, and then again near the 3rd node where the fibers stayed strong. The vines bled a milky thread that stuck to her fingers. Good. Glue in the plant meant tenacity in the rope. She twisted pairs together by rolling them over her thigh, building length through the old rhythm until the cordage sang with tension. She did not think about time. She thought about water. Water demanded angles and patience. Water punished arrogance. When she had enough cordage to circle a tree twice, she chose the largest gum and ran a waist-high line from trunk to trunk, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 back to 1, tying each with a square knot and then locking the knots with half hitches. The line made a triangle that would hold the spine of a roof, high enough to crouch under, low enough to keep wind from lifting it like a wing. She stepped back and watched the gum leaves flicker under a fresh gust. The sky grumbled closer, a long belly sound that made the water wrinkle. The first rain would be a tester, a curtain to see who had offended the planet. The real rain would come later, when the light went thin and blue at the edges and the frogs stopped laughing. She moved to the understory and chose leaves for the roof. She needed broad, ribbed fans with pronounced mid-ribs and waxy surfaces, leaves that wanted to shed rain by design. The drencher had plenty if a person knew how to ask. She cut the first with the blade angled to preserve the petiole as a ready-made hook, then cut another, then another, laying them vein to vein so that the ribs interlocked. She tested the first overlap by pouring a handful of water from a cupped leaf. The water ran off the double layer in a smooth sheet and dripped from the tips like ropes of glass. A grin lifted the corner of her mouth before she could stop it. She began to weave, tucking each petiole under the line and lashing pairs with short loops of vine so that the leaves overlapped like fish scales, bottom to top. The scale trick mattered. Rain sneaked uphill only when a builder forgot that gravity had a temper. Voices drifted from the landing patch, bright as the alloy. An instructor barked a reminder about lightning protocols and ground isolation, while a student asked if the membranes would self-heal punctures larger than 5 centimeters. Syrinx answered with a lecture about capillary action and hydrophobic coatings. Vrel bragged about a heater core that could boil a liter in 90 seconds. The insectoid twins argued over whether to vector their drain channels north or south. She kept tying. Between knots, she pushed her thumb into the resin sacs that swelled at the base of a vine and smeared the pitch into the leaf seams. The resin smelled sharp, like citrus groaning under a hot knife, and the gum trees exhaled as if pleased to be included. She sealed the ridge line and then the shoulder lines, making sure the resin answered every place an impatient person would call good enough. The drencher loved to test good enough. She glanced at the sky. The clouds had compressed into a low lid. The light had shifted from white to pewter. In the reeds to the left, the frog laughter had migrated upslope, which meant the water level in the channel had begun to flirt with the banks. She added 2 more rib rows to the roof and then crouched to scrape a shallow trench along the upslope side of the sleeping area. The trench would catch the sprinting water and escort it around, a polite denial that would save her floor from betrayal. She lined the trench with stones that wore algae like velvet and set each stone to lean just enough to nudge flow. The first fat drop smacked the back of her hand and burst into a cold star. She looked at the gum bark, counting heartbeats until the next drop. 3, then 2, then 1. The sky cleared its throat. Syrinx shouted a timing update, 2 hours until nightfall, and announced that his structure had reached operational status. The membrane hummed as it polarized, beating the rehearsal drizzle into bright pearls that ran down the alloy legs and into a catch basin with a cheerful ping. Vrel powered his heater, producing a hiss like applause. The twins opened a foil packet that unfolded into a reflective floor, then peeled back a port to reveal a vent that promised negative pressure and zero condensation. It all looked civilized, the way a showroom looks civilized before a family moves in with muddy shoes. She pressed the final seam with the flat of her thumb and felt the resin grab. The roof sagged just enough to show where water would want to rush, and the lashing lines held tight without complaining. She took her knife to the vines again and cut 4 knee-length stakes, sharpening each to a stubborn point. She drove them into the corners of her floor mat at opposing angles so the mat would not drift when the ground softened. A fifth stake took the roof's windward side and married it to the earth with a simple clove hitch. She did not trust the world, but she respected it. Respect made better knots. A second curtain of rain fell, thicker, convinced of itself. The membrane field over Sarex's frame squealed once as the pressure changed, but the beating accelerated and the catch basin chimed faster, giving the little group a music of competence. She watched for a breath, then returned to her own floor. She layered fern fronds over a lattice of cross-hatched vines, creating a springy pad that would lift her hips and shoulders away from the hungry mud. She pinched a fistful of frond tips and twisted them into a rope, tying the pad to the rear stake so it would not creep toward the trench while she slept. The rain grew teeth. It came with a slanted insistence that made conversation on the landing patch reedy and short. The frogs surrendered and went silent. The wind shouldered the gum trunks and asked the roof what it believed. The leaves whispered. The lashing answered in the old language of tension. She stayed kneeling under the ridge and watched the first real flow race across the green. It hit the overlapping leaves, slid down the scale, and leapt from the tips in streams that fell beyond the trench. The floor stayed dry enough to feel like a promise. She took stock. Fire would matter soon, but fire under the wrong roof turned lessons into evacuations. She scouted a narrow belt of ground under the leeward edge where the roof's shadow cast a dry smile. There she scooped a shallow dish and lined it with flat stones, then built a thumb-sized pyramid of split twigs that had never touched the ground. She shaved a handful of dry curls from the heart of a soft branch and tucked the curls under the pyramid like a secret. Sparks would be easy from the ferro rod in her pocket, but unnecessary bravado never made a flame warmer. She waited. Patience had a heat of its own, and the drencher respected a person who did not shout at the sky. She ran her fingers once more along the ridge and felt the resin set into a leathery skin. The roof was no cathedral, but it was honest. By the time the third curtain arrived, the one that came with wind hooks and a sideways temper, the landing patch had turned to a gray smear. Sarex's catch basin overflowed in a shining tongue, and he shouted for a siphon tube. Vrel cursed cheerfully as his heater cut out in a safety cycle and restarted with a sulk. The twins argued louder, antennae lashing, as their reflective floor wrinkled and channeled water into their bedding. She kept her voice in her chest. She tightened the windward hitch by half a finger and nudged one stone in the trench so that the current would carve a deeper shoulder. The water obeyed without drama. She touched the roof above her head and felt the drumming become a steady rush, a language she understood from other nights on other wet planets. The gum trees held, the leaves shed. Her floor did not betray her. The drencher had opinions, but so did she, and she had chosen to speak in angles, knots, and patience. When the instructor's drone buzzed past, she lifted a hand without standing. The drone winked green to mark receipt and drifted on through the rain to check the showier structures. She listened to Sarex explain load paths in a voice that tried to stay brave against the weather's laughter. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to memorize the rhythm of success. Scrape, tie, seal, test, adjust, wait. The assignment said, shelter before nightfall. The planet said, respect before shelter. She opened her eyes and smiled at nothing in particular. The drencher breathed again, and she breathed with it, small and steady under a roof of living scales that loved the rain and refused to keep it. The storm had not broken yet, but the air trembled with the heaviness of its promise. She sat on the edge of her mat, listening to the way the leaves of her roof shifted with the soft percussion of the early drops, each one testing for weakness. Her shelter whispered back, leaf to leaf, as though daring the clouds to try harder. Beyond her small camp, the alien cadets continued their frantic work. She had heard their laughter earlier when she chose to twist vines and lash leaves instead of unfolding sleek panels or deploying smart membranes. Now, that laughter sounded sharper, almost forced, as the first streaks of rain painted their alloy walls and made the ground suck greedily at their boots. Sarex, with his crystalline frame and sharp planes that glowed faintly in the dim light, had finished his tent early. He had stood before it with a pride that shone brighter than the iridescent field stretching over his alloy skeleton. The crystalline cadet was tall, his voice melodic even when tense, and he moved with the certainty of an engineer whose calculations were law. She could see him now as he paced around his glowing dome, adjusting the angles of his panels with the delicate care of a jeweler. The dome gleamed, almost smug, like a polished jewel under gray skies. He muttered equations to himself, occasionally gesturing at the seams where water began to bead. He believed in mathematics, like she believed in instinct. On the other side of the clearing, Vrel stomped about with his scaly feet, driving his alloy struts deep into the mud with the same determination he gave to every task. His reptilian frame was thick with muscle, his long tail flicking mud across the ground with each impatient move. His voice carried easily, harsh and booming, as he bragged about his heater core and how no storm could chill him tonight. His tent already steamed faintly, a thin mist rising where the heat clashed with the wet air. He stood with his chest out and his scales catching the dim light, a soldier convinced that strength and machinery always triumphed over weather. The insectoid twins worked in perfect rhythm, their antennae flicking back and forth as if sharing words no one else could hear. Their bodies gleamed dark bronze, segmented and precise, their mandibles clacking as they placed each reflective sheet. 4 arms moved as one, hammering pegs into the soil, smoothing membranes, aligning vents. They spoke little, but their movements carried confidence, an old familiarity with working as halves of the same whole. Each time one finished a knot or a press, the other followed with reinforcement, their cadence steady, mechanical, efficient. She sat silent beneath her roof and let her eyes wander over their work without judgment. She was not interested in failure or success, not yet. The rain would decide, and the drencher's rain had no mercy. She pulled a fern frond across her lap, stripping its stem to use as tinder later. Her knife flicked easily, the blade moving as though it had known her hand for years. She let her shoulders relax and her breathing slow, the way her grandfather had taught her when storms rolled across the mountains back on Earth. He had told her once that storms were not enemies but teachers. A person learned more about a shelter when the rain wanted to destroy it than when the sun praised it. The first sheet of rain came suddenly, a hiss that swallowed the frogs and flattened the reeds. Water struck the alien tents with metallic urgency, rolling off membranes and bouncing off alloy like coins scattered on stone. Syrinx cried out in delight, raising his crystalline arms as he pointed to the perfect arcs of runoff collecting into his basin. His voice rang out, triumphant, as if the storm itself had surrendered to his equations. Vrel bellowed with laughter, pounding his heater core as steam rose thicker, sending plumes into the sky that smelled faintly of burning algae. The insectoid twins moved quickly, sealing a seam that had begun to leak at one corner of their reflective floor, their mandibles clicking louder as their pace sharpened. The rain tested harder. It thickened, pouring in slanted sheets that raced across the ground and pooled into sudden rivulets. The clearing turned to a mosaic of puddles, each one swelling, merging, and reaching greedily for the cadet's ankles. Her trench filled but carried the water around, guiding it away from her mat as she had intended. She leaned back, pulled her knees close, and listened to the sharp cracks of frustration already rising beyond the hum of the rain. Syrinx's basin overflowed with a high-pitched chime, and the crystalline cadet bent desperately to reroute the flow with trembling hands. His dome, once so proud, shimmered unevenly as pressure from the pooling water forced the membrane to sag. He cried out equations again, but this time the words sounded panicked rather than triumphant. His glowing panels trembled as rivulets forced themselves inside, finding seams too small to calculate. Vrel's heater sputtered, the steam choking as water seeped into the fuel chamber. He roared, slamming the casing with his fists, as though brute force would drive the water away. His tail lashed angrily, scattering mud onto his reflective sheets. He shouted promises to the storm, daring it to chill him. Yet his shoulders had begun to hunch, and his scales glistened with more than just rain. The insectoid twins scrambled with their 4 arms, trying to seal another tier. Their reflective floor had become a mirror for the storm, puddles forming faster than their vents could drain. Their movements, once rhythmic, turned chaotic as their antennae whipped the air in agitation. One twin slipped, crashing into the other, and together they tumbled into the rising mud, their mandibles clacking in disarray. She sat still beneath her roof. The leaves above her caught the downpour with a steady rhythm, channeling each stream into neat arcs that leapt over the trench and into the swamp beyond. The resin seams held firm, the overlapping scales of green glistening with strength. She touched the edge of her mat. Dry. She reached into her pouch and pulled free a strip of dried root, chewing slowly as thunder rolled. Her eyes flicked to the cadets around her, their glowing tents flickering, their confident faces strained and anxious. She said nothing. The storm said enough. The night grew darker as the clouds thickened. Lightning forked across the sky, painting the clearing in brief, violent flashes. Each flash showed the cadets struggling more, their once proud shelters now bending under the weight of the drencher's judgment. Serex's crystal body slumped as his dome's panels buckled inward, leaking water that ran in bright streams down his legs. Vrel crouched over his heater, shielding it with his bulk, his tail thrashing in futility as the steam sputtered out. The insectoid twins fought to pull their reflective sheet higher, but the mud clung to their limbs, dragging them down with each movement. She chewed her root, swallowed, and exhaled slowly. Her hut smelled faintly of resin and wet leaves, a scent that wrapped her like a blanket. The frogs began to croak again, braver now as the rain reached its peak. She closed her eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to listen, to feel the rhythm of the water as it raced over her roof and vanished into the trench. Her grandfather's voice whispered in her memory, "Respect the storm, and the storm will leave you alive." The second hour of rain began with a roar so loud it shook the trees. The alien cadets shouted against it, their voices carried away before the words could form. She remained silent. Her roof held, her floor remained dry, and as the others shivered in their brilliant but broken shelters, she felt the strange calm of being exactly where she was meant to be, in the heart of the storm, untouched by its anger. The storm revealed its full strength with no warning, as though the first waves of rain had been nothing more than practice strikes. The night became alive with noise, the kind that rattled the ribs and pressed the lungs, 1,000 hammers falling at once upon water, wood, and flesh. The sky split with furious light, each flash burning the swamp in stark whites and blues before plunging everything back into darkness so thick it felt like smoke. She sat with her back straight under her roof of leaves, her knife resting across her lap, her fingers tight around the handle. The hut trembled with each gust, yet it held, the resin seams defying the weight of the deluge, the overlapping leaves working as one body against the chaos. She inhaled the damp air and thought not of survival, but of patience. To her, the storm was a teacher, demanding respect and quiet endurance. Serex had abandoned pride. His crystal body glistened with rain as he crawled on his knees, pressing his hands desperately against the sagging walls of his once perfect dome. The basin that had overflowed earlier now churned with muddy water, flooding the interior until his lower body disappeared beneath it. His voice rose above the storm in sharp, cracking tones, a song of equations broken and betrayed, the melody of someone trying to find numbers to calm an uncaring sky. His once melodic tone now fractured into sobs, hidden beneath the sound of pounding rain. Each time he tried to lift the dome's frame, the weight of water forced it down again, and his once proud dome sagged into a cage that pinned him to the mud. Vrel roared with defiance, his reptilian muscles straining as he heaved against the heater core that had finally drowned. Steam no longer rose. Instead, smoke hissed from the joints, acrid and bitter, stinging the air. He tore at the casing with his claws, ripping alloy apart with reckless fury, shouting into the storm as though strength could intimidate thunder. His tail thrashed behind him, striking his half-collapsed tent and scattering mud in violent sprays. His roar was a challenge, his stance that of a warrior refusing to kneel, yet his body betrayed him with shivers, his scales glistening not just from water, but from cold creeping past his bravado. For every second he fought, the storm stole another piece of his heat, and his breath became ragged clouds of steam that quickly vanished into the rain. The insectoid twins had been pulled into chaos by the mud itself. The reflective sheet that had once stood firm now clung to their limbs like a captured beast, dragging one backward each time the other pulled forward. Their four arms clawed at the slick surface, mandibles clicking in frantic rhythm as they tried to lift the sheet back into place. Their antennae whipped violently, slashing the wet air with signals of panic, their movements no longer synchronized but desperate and clumsy. One slipped deeper into the rising pool, mandibles snapping shut with a hiss as muddy water filled the space around his segmented neck. The other lunged forward, all four arms gripping, pulling with raw strength, dragging his twin back with a shriek that cut briefly through the thunder before vanishing into the night. They clung to one another as the reflective sheet collapsed entirely, smothering their work into nothing more than a drowned patch of fabric sinking under mud. She remained quiet in her corner of the swamp. Her trench worked with calm certainty, guiding rivers of runoff around her floor as though the water itself had chosen to obey her earlier decisions. The hut creaked under the storm's fury but did not falter, its roof gleaming with rivulets that slipped away in perfect order. She touched the cordage once, testing the tension, then drew her hand back with a nod. The vines had swelled with rain, tightening into knots that would not betray her. She pulled her knees closer, tucking her chin into the collar of her jacket, watching through the sheet of water that blurred the clearing. In every direction, she saw chaos and collapse, every proud shelter reduced to fragments of struggle. Yet the storm could not touch her floor. The fire she had prepared remained dry, waiting for a spark at the right moment. Her heartbeat stayed steady, her breath calm. The storm screamed, but she would not answer with fear. Syrinx finally abandoned his ruined dome, crawling from its watery grave with limbs that clinked and scraped like broken glass. His once radiant glow had dimmed, his body flickering weakly with fractured light. He dragged himself through the mud toward higher ground, his melodic voice reduced to whispers of calculations that no longer mattered. He collapsed against a tree, curling his crystalline arms around his chest, shivering as cold seeped through even his mineral body. His pride had gone silent, swallowed by water and darkness. Vrel staggered from his tent, claws dripping with shards of alloy, his scales dulled by the relentless downpour. His tail dragged heavily, weighed down with mud. He stumbled forward with one hand pressed to his chest as if to keep his heart beating against the cold. His breath a labored growl that no longer sought to intimidate, but only to survive. He fell to his knees, mud splashing around his frame, and forced himself back up with a snarl, his stubbornness fighting every instinct to surrender. Yet his eyes burned less with defiance now, and more with fear, a fear he masked with volume but could not truly hide. The insectoid twins clung together, their segmented bodies slick with mud, their reflective sheet abandoned and half buried in the rising pools. They pressed their heads together, antennae twitching in exhausted, frantic pulses, no longer fighting the storm, but holding one another as the world raged around them. Their mandibles clicked slower, each sound strained, their four arms tangled like roots trying to resist the pull of a flood. They did not move to rebuild. They only held on, hoping the storm would forget them long enough for the night to end. She watched all of it in silence, her eyes narrow, her body still. Her shelter had not betrayed her, and in its dry center she felt not triumph, but clarity. The Academy's test had not been about ingenuity in shining metal or strength in alloy beams. It had been about listening. The storm did not punish her because she had listened. The resin, the overlapping leaves, the trench, Each piece had been an answer spoken in the drencher's language. She exhaled, slow and steady, and for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to stretch her legs and lie back on her fern mat. The rain hammered her roof, the thunder roared, but none of it touched her. The storm had made its judgment. It had stripped the cadets of their pride, their voices, their certainty. It had spared her because she had approached it with respect instead of arrogance. As lightning carved the swamp into harsh outlines again, she closed her eyes and listened to the rhythm of rain against leaf. The others shivered, soaked and beaten, but she did not move to call them in. The lesson was not hers to teach. The storm itself would do that. And until dawn, she would wait in calm patience, the human in a dry hut surrounded by collapse, proving in silence what no technology could. The night had grown deeper, the swamp turning into a labyrinth of shadows and silver light each time lightning split the sky. The storm raged on, unrelenting, but inside her leaf hut the air stayed warm, the floor dry, and the faint crackle of a newly lit fire pushed back the edge of the darkness. She had struck her ferro rod into the curls of tinder, and the flame had caught quickly, protected by the careful roof that shed the rain like a living creature. Now the fire glowed in a shallow pit, smoke slipping upward through the cracks where leaves overlapped, seeping into the storm as though the hut itself breathed. She sat close to the warmth, her knees drawn under her chin, chewing a strip of roasted root and letting the quiet inside her shelter steady her pulse. Outside, the swamp seethed with misery. Sarek stumbled first toward her glow, drawn like a moth toward the impossible sight of fire that burned bright in such violent rain. His crystalline body looked fractured under the dim light, patches of his once radiant form flickering weakly as if his very structure fought to hold together. His legs dragged through the mud, knees buckling, his arms wrapped across his chest to protect what warmth still lingered inside him. He moved like glass about to shatter. His melodic voice was gone, replaced by a hollow rasp, yet his glowing eyes fixed on the fire as though it promised salvation. He stopped short of her hut, staring at the simple walls of leaves that had done what his panels could not. For a long moment he stood silent, water cascading off his body, until at last he sank to his knees and bowed his head, no longer calculating, only pleading without words. Vrel came soon after, crashing through reeds and vines with the stubborn rage of a creature who refused to fall even as his body betrayed him. His tail dragged a deep groove through the mud, his claws clutched at empty air as though still trying to fight the storm itself. He smelled of smoke and wet scales, the remnants of his heater clinging to him like a bitter perfume. His chest heaved, each breath a growl forced through clenched jaws, and his eyes burned red with exhaustion. He staggered into view, saw the fire, and for the first time that night his roaring ceased. He froze, shoulders hunched, the muscles in his arms twitching as though torn between pride and desperation. Then he stumbled forward, fell to one knee, and lowered his head, not in reverence, but in raw necessity. He pressed his clawed hand against the earth and dragged himself closer, gritting his teeth against every instinct that told him to never seek help. The insectoid twins emerged last, moving in halting steps, their bronze bodies dulled by mud, antennae drooping with exhaustion. One leaned heavily against the other, his limbs trembling too violently to carry his own weight, while the second bore him forward with strained determination. Their mandibles clicked weakly, no longer sharp and confident but slow, hesitant, almost mournful. They moved as one creature barely held together, dragging themselves into the faint circle of light cast from her fire. When they reached the edge of her trench, both collapsed, chests heaving, limbs twitching as the storm poured mercilessly over them. Yet their eyes lifted toward her hut, glistening with desperation and awe, as if the simple sight of her dry roof mocked the complexity of all their failed work. She did not speak. She watched them through the flicker of firelight, her face calm but not unfeeling. She knew the storm had already taught them more than any words could. Her leaf roof, her resin seams, her trench, None of it had been meant as triumph over them, but as harmony with the world they had mocked. Now, beaten and drenched, they understood the language she had listened to from the beginning. She shifted on her mat and gestured with one hand toward the small opening of her hut. It was not an invitation filled with ceremony or pity. It was simple, practical, an acknowledgement that survival mattered more than pride. Syrinx moved first. His crystalline body cracked faintly as he dragged himself across the trench, each motion stiff and pained. When he entered the hut, the glow of the fire danced across his fractured form, making him shimmer like a broken jewel. He folded himself into a corner, curling tightly, eyes fixed on the flames as though afraid they might vanish. Vrel followed with a growl, his heavy frame scraping against the ground as he pushed himself forward. He paused at the opening, his reptilian pride flaring one last time, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth creaked. But the warmth spilling from the fire reached him, and the smell of dry earth and smoke wrapped around his senses. He ducked inside, crouching low under the roof, and sat heavily near the entrance, his broad shoulders trembling with cold. He extended his clawed hands toward the flames, the steam rising as heat touched his soaked scales, and his eyes closed in exhausted surrender. The insectoid twins hesitated at the threshold, their antennae flicking uncertainly. They clung to one another, mandibles clicking softly, as though unsure if they had earned the right to enter. She looked at them, her expression unreadable, then shifted her mat slightly to one side to make space. That single act was enough. They dragged themselves forward, limbs scraping the earth, collapsing onto the floor just beyond the firelight. Their bodies twitched with relief as the warmth reached them, and their antennae lifted weakly toward the smoke curling through the roof's cracks. Inside the hut, the storm's fury felt muffled, as though the leaves themselves had woven a barrier between rage and peace. Water struck the roof with relentless force, but it only ran off in smooth streams that hissed into the trench outside. The fire crackled, feeding on the twigs and roots she had gathered earlier, casting long shadows across crystalline limbs, scaled shoulders, and segmented shells. The cadets huddled in silence, each one broken in a different way, yet all warmed by the same small flame. She reached into her pouch and drew out more roots, placing them carefully near the fire's edge to roast. The smell of charred skin and sweet starch filled the hut, mingling with resin and smoke. She chewed one slowly, then handed another toward Syrinx, whose trembling hands accepted it with a whisper of gratitude. She passed one to Vrel, who snatched it with claws that shook but did not crush it. His growl softened into something close to thanks. The insectoid twins received theirs last, mandibles clicking softly as they broke the roasted root between them, sharing as they always had. No words were spoken beyond those gestures. The fire spoke louder, its warmth wrapping around them, its crackle carrying meaning deeper than sentences. The storm continued outside, furious and endless, but inside the hut there was calm, a fragile harmony born not of pride or invention, but of humility before the world's force. She leaned back against the trunk of the gum tree that formed the hut's spine, her eyes half-lidded, her mind steady. The cadets had come to her not because she demanded it, but because the storm had left them no choice. That was the true lesson. When arrogance collapses, only respect for the land remains. The night stretched on, long and merciless. Yet within the glow of her leaf roof, firelight, and trench, the survivors found something they had not expected: safety. She did not comfort them with words. She did not gloat. She simply shared what she had built, and in that silence, the cadets learned more than the academy could have ever taught with drills or equations. When dawn finally crept close, faint and gray, the fire still burned low, the hut still stood unbroken, and inside its shelter, every cadet who had mocked her simplicity now rested in dry warmth, guarded by the patience of one human who had listened to the storm instead of fighting it. Dawn arrived as a pale hush rather than a color, a thinning in the rain's voice that let quieter sounds step forward, the soft suck of mud releasing its grip. the faint creak of wet bark, the shy return of frog calls stitched into the edges of the clearing. She stirred the embers with a split twig and coaxed a small tongue of flame to life, feeding it with dry shavings she had tucked in the lee of the stones. The fire answered with a steady breath, and a warmer glow spread across crystalline plains, scaled shoulders, and bronze segments. Sarek sat upright first, his body dim but no longer flickering, his hands outstretched with the reverence of a craftsman who had found heat again. Vrel rolled one shoulder and exhaled a grudging sigh, not of defeat now, but of reluctant respect for warmth earned rather than forced. The insectoid twin nearest the door flexed each limb slowly to test strength, while his brother held still a moment longer and then nodded with quiet precision. The storm had not left gifts. It had left debts that each survivor would repay with humility. Outside, the clearing looked like a battlefield drowned in gray. What had been sharp angles and proud arcs had slumped into hunched silhouettes, frames half swallowed by sucking pools that mirrored the colorless sky. Her roof shone with beads of water that slid in clean lines and fell with musical regularity into the trench that had never overflowed. She rose and stepped out into the morning's breath, letting a spray of cool droplets kiss her cheek as a breeze combed the surface of the swamp. Underfoot the ground still sulked, but the water had begun its retreat, conceding that the night's argument had ended. She tightened one hitch by a finger's width and pressed a palm to the ridge seam where the resin had cured into a smooth amber line. The roof felt like a living shield that had learned her name. Sarek joined her at the edge of the doorway, folding his translucent hands as if he feared to touch anything not built in a lab. His voice had recovered some of its musical lilt, but the melody moved more slowly now, careful not to step on conclusions it had not earned. He asked no questions yet. He only watched the way the water left the leaves, and the trench surrendered nothing. Vrel crouched near the fire, feeding it another measured stick, his jaw set in concentration rather than stubbornness, the workmanlike rhythm of a soldier who had discovered a new kind of discipline. The first insectoid twin pushed mud from the reflective plates of his forearm with the corner of a shell, while his brother examined the cut lines in her cordage with attentive stillness. Each learned in silence, because silence had been the one voice the storm had not drowned. A thin-bellied drone arrived with the morning's light, its stabilizers sending small ripples across puddles as it hovered, lens dilating to capture angles and outcomes. The Academy's insignia flickered green along its rim, and a crisp tone announced the approach of the instructors. She raised her hand once, and the drone chimed acknowledgement before drifting along a slow spiral that traced the circle of failure and the island of success. A shuttle cut a narrow wound in the clouds and exhaled toward the clearing with controlled impatience. When the landing gear kissed mud, the hatch spilled stairs and the cool edge of conditioned air. An instructor in slate armor stepped down first, visor lifted to expose a face trained to hide reactions, yet unable to fully conceal a fractional lift of the brow at the sight of her hut still standing. The instructor spoke little during initial inspection. A stylus moved, a field slate recorded, and a silent tension formed as measured glances took in torn membranes, bent alloy, drowned heaters, and a leaf roof that shed last traces of rain with unbothered grace. Sarek stood, head bowed, as the instructor's path paused at his collapsed dome. Vrel straightened unknowingly into parade posture, then forced his shoulders down with a grimace, unwilling to pretend at ceremony after such a night. The first insectoid twin cleared a clog from a vent with 2 precise flicks, while his brother lifted the corner of the reflective floor to expose where water had tunneled under, despite every promise from its schematics. The instructor's gaze returned to the hut and held a beat longer. "Demonstrate construction," the instructor said, voice even, neither cold nor kind. She nodded, wiped a palm clean on her trouser leg, and began. She did not speak at first. With the knife, she cut a fresh length of vine in one clean draw, stopped at the strong node with practiced economy, and rolled paired strands down her thigh into a firm twist that hummed when she tugged it. She indicated the 3 trees with a gesture that traced the triangle, then looped the cordage in place and locked the knot with a hitch that sat low and patient. She cut a single leaf from the understory, turned it in her hands to show the wax, the ribs, the slope of the blade, then tucked the petiole under the line and laced a second leaf over the first with a half lashing that guided where water would leap. She pressed her thumb to the amber seam, let a bead of resin catch the light, and smoothed it with the flat of the blade. The instructor watched her hands rather than her face, because the lesson lived in the rhythm and not in the explanation. Sarek stepped forward with a question that had stranded itself on his lips for hours. He asked about pitch angles relative to sheet load under lateral wind. She answered by lifting the leaf's tip and showing how a single degree too shallow let a droplet cling for a heartbeat and then seek a seam. He nodded once, not in the manner of an engineer who found a number, but like a student who had finally found a teacher in the land, not the ledger. Vrel asked whether her trench depth had followed a standard measure. She dragged the toe of her boot through the grit and traced the slow spiral of a curve that accepted the swamp's impatience and handed it back as a decision instead of a barrier. The first insectoid twin asked nothing. He ran 2 fingers along the lashing and then duplicated the knot in perfect miniature from a scrap of vine that he had rescued from the mud. His brother placed his palm against the gum bark and held still, as if promising the tree an apology on behalf of all the cadets who had ignored it. The instructor circled again, then spoke into the drone's open channel with clipped clarity. Functional shelter observed at dawn, fire maintenance recorded, water management successful, structural integrity of leaf roof confirmed under prolonged load, single tool compliance verified, the stylus tapped twice. The hush that followed tasted like the moment before a verdict in a court where the judge had already learned the truth. The instructor turned to face the survivors and did not raise a voice to carry the words above the wind. The storm had ended. No voice needed to fight it anymore. Assessment, the instructor said. Survival is not a contest of materials. Survival is the practice of attention. The human cadet listened. The rest attempted to speak louder than the planet. Scores will reflect outcomes. No one argued. Sarek inclined his head, the motion slow, respectful, and shaped by a humility that looked new on his crystalline frame. Vrel lifted his chin, inhaled, and exhaled without a growl, a compromise with reality that did not diminish him. The first insectoid twin touched his forearm plates together in a brief salute, while his brother mirrored the gesture with a smaller echo. She stood with her knife sheathed and her palms open, receiving nothing more than was due and nothing less than the truth. Logistics followed. The shuttle disgorged recovery kits and tow lines. The instructor ordered no one to help her dismantle the hut. She cut the lashings herself, rolled the cordage with the care of a woman bundling a story for later retelling, and returned the leaves to the understory with a quiet apology to the plants that had lent their strength. Sarek knelt unasked and rinsed her knife in clean water he had collected from a crook in the roots, then set it on a folded palm for her to take. Vrel anchored a line and dragged a broken frame clear without complaint or commentary. The first insectoid twin retrieved half-buried pegs with the deliberate grace of a scribe correcting a careful text, while his brother stacked the reflective sheets with corners aligned so perfectly that not a single drip escaped the pile. When the clearing had become an honest mess rather than a tragedy, the instructor called the survivors to form a line. The drone hovered overhead and translated posture into record. Commendations, the instructor said. Human cadet, highest mark for fieldcraft, water discipline, and shelter design. Crystalline cadet Sarek. Note added for adaptive learning and technical humility demonstrated in post-storm analysis. Reptilian cadet Vrel. Commendation for team support and equipment recovery under fatigue. Insectoid twins. Recognition for rapid skill acquisition and structural documentation of successful knotwork for Academy archives. The words did not sparkle. They settled like clean stones in a riverbed, solid, placed, and permanent. She received a small emblem. No glittering metal, only a narrow strip of woven fiber threaded with a thread of resin-hardened amber. The instructor pinned it to the collar of her jacket with a nod that carried more weight than applause. The emblem smelled faintly of citrus and rain. Syrinx watched the pin catch light and then looked to the gum trees with an expression that promised future listening. Vrel touched the emblem's edge once, careful not to scratch the amber, and muttered something that began as a growl and ended as a blessing. The first insectoid twin leaned close, mandibles parted in quiet fascination, while his brother sketched the pattern in the air with a fingertip to memorize the weave. Before boarding, the instructor paused at the hut's footprint and spoke in a tone that acknowledged the swamp as much as the students. Next rotation will build with local guidance protocols engaged. The human cadet will serve as peer instructor for preliminary site selection and drainage. That was not a request. That was trust, wrapped in duty. She nodded once and accepted, not for pride, but because the storm had given her an obligation along with the lesson. On the climb into the shuttle, the survivors looked back one by one. Syrinx's gaze lingered on the trench's quiet curve. Vrel's eyes tracked the ridgeline where the resin had turned gold in the weak sun. The first insectoid twin focused on the knot he had tied and left intact on a practice line, while his brother watched a frog hop across a patch of mud that had looked bottomless only hours before. She looked last and saw nothing to claim. The hut had been necessary. It had been right. Now the swamp would take back what it owned, and she would carry the knowledge, not the trophy. In the Academy's debrief hall, the storm lived only in recordings and damp gear stacked by the door. The instructor played no dramatizations and offered no scolding. A still image of the leaf roof held on the wall while a single sentence appeared beneath it. Respect makes better knots. Syrinx stood and volunteered to rebuild his design with a new pitch based on the leaf's lesson, and the room listened without laughter. Vrel requested assignment to drainage planning on the next exercise, and the request carried no shame. The insectoid twins submitted a tidy document titled Lashing Patterns with Minimal Tooling, and the archive accepted it with a stamp that sounded like a promise. When she left the hall, the clouds over the campus had already begun to thin into ragged islands, and a clean wind moved across the training grounds. She walked the perimeter once, not out of habit but out of gratitude for ground that remembered rain honestly. At the gate, Syrinx approached with a small pouch. He opened it to reveal a set of micro beads cut from fractured panel edges, each one ground smooth and pale. He asked her to take one as a marker for a lesson learned. She accepted, pressed the bead into the seam of her jacket cuff, and thanked him with the kind of smile that finishes a conversation without requiring words. Vrel nodded from a distance and lifted a hand in a gesture that meant, for him, more than apology or praise. The first insectoid twin touched his chest with 2 fingers and tilted his head, while his brother mirrored the salute with exact timing. She answered with a small lift of her palm and kept walking. That night, back in a quiet dormitory where the air smelled of metal polish and starch rather than resin and rain, she set the knife on the table and cleaned it with slow strokes. The blade shone, plain and stubborn. The cuff bead caught a line of light. She closed her eyes and heard the roof whisper, the trench answer, the gum trunks breathe. The storm had spoken and she had listened. The Academy could measure outcomes, issue emblems, and write commendations. But the drencher had given the only certificate that mattered, a shelter that held when the sky tried to take it. She tucked the knife away, turned out the light, and slept without dream or vigilance, not because the world had softened, but because she had learned how to meet it. In the weeks that followed, the campus roofs carried a new angle. Drain ditches curved with a quiet grace that pleased the groundskeepers and baffled no one who had knelt in the swamp that morning. Instructors began each field brief with a single request: listen first. Syrinx stopped reciting tolerances until he had touched bark. Vrel stopped promising what heat would do until he had asked wind what it wanted. The insectoid twins taught a seminar where cadets learned to make rope with cold hands and calm minds. She spoke rarely, demonstrated often, and adjusted a knot with a fingertip when a student's impatience tried to speak in a loud voice again. The Academy archive filed the exercise under standard training with one addendum. Following extreme weather event, Human Cadet introduced vernacular shelter methodology that increased survival margin by measurable factors. The sentence sat there, clean and dry. Out beyond the walls, rain still found the earth and asked the same question it had asked for centuries. On every field where that question mattered, a new answer waited, strung between three trees, patient and strong, built by hands that had learned to listen.